Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is 43rd lecture of this course. By this time, we have already covered the major portion of this course. And today, our topic of discussion is case study. What is case study? Some people say it is collection of data. However, it's not only a collection of method of data, but it's a full method of research. It is an intensive study of a case which may be individual, an institution, a system, a community, an organization, an event or an entire culture. The doctor checks the patient. He examines or she examines the patient thoroughly, and they then, based on those informations or data that he has gathered from the patient from his thorough examination, the doctor comes to the conclusion of the disease with which the patient is afflicted. So it is the case of an individual. Suppose we want to study the working of an institution. Say we want to study the working of, say, police, or we want to study the working of the executive, or we want to study the bureaucracy. These are institutions. So, whatever we have selected, it would be thoroughly studied. Data would be collected by thoroughly studying the institution. And then the research would be done, analysis would be done, and the conclusion found from those analyses. If we want to study a system, say monarchy or democracy, then also we can study it, take a case study of, say, Saudi monarchy. Then we can study it thoroughly and then draw the data and find the conclusion. If we want to study a community, say, for example, a tribal community, Bedouins in the deserts, or we want to study some tribal people in Andaman and Nicobar, or we want to study the Oraons of Jharkhand, then what we have to do? We have to, in fact, study, study the whole unit of this tribe and collect the various data about various aspects of their functioning, their life, and then analyze the data and arrive at the conclusion. Similarly, if we are studying any organization, we may study the United Nations, we may study the International Monetary Fund, we may study the WTO, and we can collect the data about these organizations, analyze it, and find the conclusions, or an event or an entire culture is to be studied. So, when the attention is focused on the development of a case, then it is called the case history. For example, how a juvenile became criminal. That is to be studied, because nobody criminals becomes criminal without any circumstances and environment. Why he was attracted to this criminal life, that is to be studied, so that the reasons could be found and the policies could be devised for, in fact, controlling or completely stopping this phenomena. There may be many reasons for a child to become a criminal. Maybe he was not given attention, he does not have parents, none of his parents were alive, and the relatives also did not give attention to them, or hundreds of causes. So, we have to, if we have to study the juvenile, how he became a criminal, we have to study through the case study method. So, a case study is not only data collection, but it is a research strategy or an empirical inquiry that investigates a contemporary phenomenon using multiple sources of evidence. So, whatever the subject, to qualify as a case study, it must be a bounded system, it must be a unit, an entity in itself. So, as we observe that United Nations is an entity, IMF is an entity, WTO is an entity, the Oraons of Jharkhand are an entity, the Bedouins of the deserts, they are also an entity. So, the case, the subject must be a unit in itself. Then, what are the characteristics of this case study? It studies whole units in their totality and not some selected aspects or variables of these units. When a patient goes to the doctor, then the doctor checks the patient and gives him the tests, sends him for tests for his body, so that the problem can be located. and and the the patient cannot be checked in partiality, in partial. So the and similarly all the examples that the units which we have selected to study as a subject have to be studied in their totality and not about some selected aspects of the variables of these units. In case study method, the researcher employs several methods in data collection to prevent errors and distortions. So, it often studies a single unit. One unit is one study that we have been telling. It perceives the respondent as a knowledgeable person, not just a source of data, and it studies the typical cases. What are the principles involved in the case study method? Number one, multiple sources are used. Use of one source of data collection does not give adequate evidence for generalization, but getting information from several sources like interviewing, observing, analyzing documents is regarded as the major strength of the study. So, if the researcher is studying the say a tribe, then he is not going to stop just by observing them or interviewing them, but they are they are observed, of course, very in very detail. They are interviewed also wherever possible, and if there are some documents about them, that is also collected. So, from several sources, the data is collected about the subject, and this is why this is regarded as one of the major strengths of the case study. In this case study method, the evidence from which conclusions are drawn in the case study has not only to be stated and specific cases cited, like criminological investigation in a crime case in the court, but it is also to be preserved for some time so that the evaluator should be able to verify the source and evidence. So, the evidence they in the case the evidence for which the researcher has collected for the conclusion, they have to be stated also, and they have to be cited also, and they have to be preserved for some time so that the evaluators can verify the source and the evidence, which again gives credibility to the data that is collected from the case study. The data has to be recorded also, either in the form of sketchy notes in observation and interviews, or it may be tape recorded in minute details. If a few notes are taken at the time of interview observation, full notes may be written later as soon as possible. So, recording of the data is must. How it is to be recorded? Either in the form of notes or tape recorded, recording all the minute details, and of course if jottings are done, if few notes are taken at the time of interview, full notes have to be written later on, maybe in the same evening. What are the purposes of the case study? Purpose is to use it as preliminary to major intensive investigation, to probe the phenomenon deeply, to use it as unique, typical, and interesting in its own right, to get intimate and detailed information about the structure, process, and complexity of the research project, to formulate a hypothesis, to conceptualize, to operationalize the variables, to expand quantitative findings, to test the feasibility of the quantitative study. Now we discuss the types of the case studies. These case studies are of many types. Number one, historical case studies. These studies trace the development of an organization system over time. The study of an adult criminal right from his childhood through adolescence and youth is an example of this type of case study. This type depends more on interviews, recording, and documents. So, the study of, say, International Monetary Fund, it will be done over time. The study of United Nations, it would be done over time. Also, of course, say a study of, say, casteism, communalism, these would be done over time in a unit. Casteism or communalism in a unit of society would be traced over time. And similarly, the development of a person as a criminal would be traced from his childhood, then his youth, and then the study would be completed rather. So, the historical case studies studies the problem or studies the subject through the time, over time, because the phenomena takes to shape, or the phenomena which we are going to study does not just occur in one moment. It is traced to the past, and that past have also to be researched. This is the historical case studies. The second is observational case studies. These focus on observing a drunkard, a teacher, a student, a union leader, some activity, event, or a specific group of people. However, the researchers in this type of study are rarely total participants or total observers. We are in the study of drunkard, the researcher cannot become a drunkard. If we are studying a teacher, then of course the researcher cannot become a teacher or a student or union leader, because he has to study the unit and in studying this unit he has to observe them. So, these are observational case studies where the subject is to be observed, whether it is a structured observation or non-structured observation, whether it is disguised or open. This has to be decided by the researcher depending upon the situation there. However, of course, in many of these, the researcher cannot be a participant observer. He can only be a non-participant observer in many of the cases. Of course, in some cases it is possible, but in many it is not possible. So, if the subject is studying a drunkard or studying a drug addict or anybody else, a teacher or a leader, then it comes under the observational case studies method. Then we have the oral history case studies. These are usually first person narratives that the researcher collects using extensive interviewing of a single individual. For example, again in the case of a drug addict or an alcoholic or a retired person who fails to adjust himself in his son's family, the use of this approach depends more on the nature and cooperation of the respondent. What is here? Here the subject is extensively interviewed, and then by his extensive interview the data is collected, and the data that is collected is again put to analysis. So, we have given the examples of the drug addict or the alcoholics. So, but the thing is that they should cooperate with the respondent. The alcoholic or the drug addict or the retired person who has not been able to adjust with the son's family, they should cooperate with the researcher. Otherwise, they would not reveal the required information, and the data collection exercise would be meaningless without their cooperation. So, anyway, in oral history case studies, it is a first person narratives is collected using extensive interviewing of that subject. That is the oral case history studies. Then we have the clinical case studies. This approach aims at understanding in depth a particular individual, such as a patient in the hospital, a prisoner in the jail, a woman in a rescue home, a problem child in a school, etc., etc. These involve detailed interviews, observations, going through records and reports, and so on. So, if there is a patient and what happens with the patient? The patient is given a very important treatment or serious attention, and then the patient is subjected to various kind of tests. That is the collection of the data or the information on the patients. And depending upon these data which has been collected through the extensive study of that patient, a prescription is written. First the problem is diagnosed, disease is diagnosed, and then a, a prescription is written for the treatment of the diagnosed problem. This is the case with so many examples are over there for such cases. The next is the situational case studies. This forms studies of particular events. The views of all participants in the event are sought. For example, a communal riot. How it started with conflict between two persons of two different religious groups. How each person sought support of persons of his own religion present at the spot. How police was informed. How police arrested persons of one particular religious group. How power elite interfered and pressurized the police department. How did public and the media react, and so on. Pulling all these views together, a depth is provided that contributes significantly to the understanding of the event. So, we can extend to any other event which happens in the society. There is a protest rally and it goes berserk and becomes non-violent. That is also to be studied in the situational case studies. So, it studies particular events, particular phenomena, particular problem which has happened, and then the views of all participants in the event are sought. And on the basis of that, on the basis of the data that was collected, the report is written on that. So, that is the situational case studies. Then we have the multi-case studies. It is a collection of case studies or a form of replication, that is multiple experiments. For example, we can take 3 case studies and analyze them on replication logic. This logic is that each case will either produce contrary results or similar results. The outcome will demonstrate either support for the initial propositions or a need to revise and retest with another set of cases. The advantage of multiple case design is that the evidence that has been collected is verified and verified, is re-verified. So, that is the advantage. So, in the multi-case studies, in fact, it's a kind of replication of the multiple experiments. So, suppose 2, 3, 4 case studies have already taken place. So, these again there would be replication of the study, and then outcome would demonstrate either to support the initial propositions or need to revise and retest with another set of cases. So, that is the multi-case studies. Then what are the assumptions of the case study? The case study is based on several assumptions. The important assumptions may be listed as follows. Number 1, the assumption of uniformity in the basic human nature in spite of the fact that human behavior may vary according to situations. If we are studying Hurons of, say, Jharkhand or Bedouins of, say, desert, or we are studying the a tribal community from the Andaman and Nicobar, then they basically are form a uniformity, they are a unit, and the broader in broader aspects of their life they have uniformity. Then the assumption of studying the natural history of the unit concerned, that the unit or the subject that we are studying, so the natural history of the unit would be done. The assumption of comprehensive study of the unit concerned, that there would be comprehensive study of the subject that we have chosen for our researches. What are the phases involved? How do we proceed? So, we discuss very quickly the major phases which are involved in the working of or implementing the case study method. Number 1, recognition and determination of the status of the phenomenon to be investigated, or the unit, or basically the unit of attention. Second, we have to choose the unit of attention, what would be the unit of study. Then collection of data, examination and history of the given phenomenon. Then third, diagnosing and identifying the causal factors as a basis for remedial or developmental treatment. What are the causes of their problems, to identify and recommend the remedial measures or the development treatment, whatever it be. Fourth, application of the remedial measures, that is treatment and therapy. This phase is characterized as casework. And then finally, fifth, the follow-up program to determine effectiveness of the treatment applied. So, these are the major phases involved, which begin from identifying the unit of attention and ends up at the follow-up program to determine effectiveness of the treatment that was applied subsequent to the diagnosis of the problem or the unit. What are the advantages of the case study method? It makes in-depth study possible. It is flexible with respect to you using methods for collecting data. It could be questionnaire, it could be interview, it could be observation, etc. It could be anything. It could be used for studying any dimension of the topic, that is, it could study one aspect and may not include other aspects. it can be conducted in practically any kind of social setting. And of course, case studies are cheap to work upon. These are less expensive. Then what are the limitations of the case study system? Number one, subjective bias. The case study design is regarded with not so respect because of the investigator's subjectivity in collecting data for supporting or refuting a particular explanation. Many a time, the investigator allows personal views to influence the direction of the findings and his conclusions, because what we see that the researcher is all in all and there is no control over the researcher, and suppose the researcher becomes biased, he becomes prejudiced, so all the exercise of data collection and the exercise of writing the report would be would become full of flaws, because everything the bias of the researcher has percolated or in fact entered the research process, and that is very much possible also. Second, the little evidence for scientific generalizations. It is said that a case study provides little evidence for inferences and generalizing theory. How can generalization be made from a single case? The case studies are generalizable. However, the case studies are generalizable to theoretical propositions, not to statistical positions. The object of case study is to expand theory and not to undertake statistical generalizations. Then of course, it is very time consuming. Case study is time consuming as it produces a lot of information which is difficult to analyze adequately. Selectivity has naturally a tendency to be biased, but if the case study is focused on relevant issues of person or even understudied, it need not be lengthy. Then the fourth, doubtful reliability. It is very difficult to establish reliability in the case study. The investigator cannot prove his authenticity for obtaining data or having no bias in analyzing them. It is not easy to fix steps and procedures explicitly to the extent that others are unable to replicate the same study. So, that is it. Then the missing validity. What is that? The investigators in the case study fail to develop a sufficiently operational set of measures. As such, check of and balances of reliable instruments are found missing. For investigator, what seems true is more important than what is true. So, that is the problem with the case study method. Yet one more argument against the case study is that it has no representativeness. That is, each case study does not represent the similar cases. That is, if we have studied the case of the Orans of the Jharkhand, this does not represent the any tribal community from the Andaman and Nicobar, or the tribal community in the deserts, that is Bedouin. So that way it lacks the power and the capacity of being generalized for the for all of the cases, similar cases. That is also one of the demerits of the case study. So, dear friends, we have already gone through the case study method, and we find that, of course, case study method is not only a way of collecting the data, but it is a full-fledged research program, and its conditionalities, its types, its advantages and disadvantages were discussed by us till now. So, we find that it is a very useful study in some of the problems of afflicting the society, the nation and the world. However, it has, like any other method, it has its own demerits and it has its own merits. So, it depends upon the researcher that he decides whether he has to go with the case study method, depending upon the the depending upon the nature of the problem that he has taken to study for his or her research. So, if the researcher is sure or thinks that the subject he is going to study warrants to use subject he is going to study warrants the use of case study method for his research, he is welcome. The only thing is that he should be careful that those limitations associated with the case study methods are not allowed to creep into his research program. So, with this, I am I wish I have been able to clear the subject under our discussion, that is the case study method. Thank you very much.